Some years ago, I organized a workshop at the Peace Research Institute Oslo and Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies on the topic of ethical problems in humanitarian action. There has come up a lot of critique about humanitarian action, about its political role and unintended consequences. That has also led to a very important reflection on the ethics of humanitarian action as such. And in this workshop, we brought together several both scholars and representatives of Norwegian humanitarian organizations who came together to discuss this topic. And after that discussion, one of the participants came up to me and said that actually many of the things that you discussed today come up most starkly in the setting of humanitarian negotiations and mediation. The settings where humanitarian organizations negotiate for access or for how to deliver assistance with state authorities, local authorities, armed groups, others controlling and influencing the territory where they operate. And this put me on the path towards a research project that I would like to present to you now. On that path, I also ran into Christina Ropstorff, who turned out to share my interest both in humanitarian negotiations and mediation and in ethics of international affairs. We have a similar background in philosophy, but also in social science and international relations. And we've looked at both peace building, humanitarian action, and global security issues in our work. So we sat down and formed something that we first called a network on the ethics of humanitarian negotiations, and we developed a project. On that path, we also then, through a workshop, involved several others like Claude Brydelein from the Center of Competence of Humanitarian Negotiations, and Antonio De Lauri, who's a professor at the Christian Michelsen Institute in Bergen, and now the director of the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, who had a project on humanitarian diplomacy with many perspectives and scholars that were of direct relevance to this project, and whose work we also draw on when forming this. So Christina and I developed a project that has now received funding from the Norwegian Research Council and is just beginning. So yesterday we had a kickoff in this project with all the partners present. You see the logos of the partners on the left side of this picture. And there I had made a presentation that I thought I could also now record to post on our website and make available for others in case there would be someone with such a specific interest. Because this goes into the details of a research project. It doesn't go so much into the actual subject, although I will say something about the background of the project. Most of this is about the project as it's outlined in the project description. This is how the project description looks, and I tried to represent it through this Presi presentation. Through the project, we have some scientific objectives. We also have some objectives for the impact of this project, and those are rather ambitious because this is the first project that really explores this topic, and therefore we want, through the research, to also introduce the ethics of humanitarian negotiation to university education, not only to research, and to professional trainings on humanitarian negotiation, as well as informing policy and public debate on the ethics of humanitarian negotiation, but also through that topic, increasing the awareness and understanding of ethics of humanitarian action in general. Because by zooming into the question of the negotiations, we actually crystallize some of the most important challenges for humanitarian action in general. But the scientific objective of the project is developing and disseminating an analytical framework for the study of ethical problems in humanitarian negotiations. This is a very broad objective, and we also use the notion of humanitarian negotiations very broadly. And it includes the notion of humanitarian mediation, which is a situation where a third party enters a setting where different actors face a humanitarian problem and where the mediator helps them agreeing on how to address the problem. So as you see, that's a different type of setting than where the humanitarian is one of the negotiating parties and negotiates on behalf of a specific organization. However, there are overlaps between the two, because also the mediator may actually be a representative of an organization, may also be sort of a representative of a humanitarian sector, giving advice on what the available resources are and so on. So there is not necessarily a very sharp line between the more narrow notion of negotiations and humanitarian mediation. And you see also how there are overlaps between humanitarian mediation and peace mediation, in particular on lower levels, communal levels, where a mediation will often then be about how to solve a problem like a road that has been damaged and that needs to be repaired, but where both sides of the conflict need to agree on how to solve that problem. That can both be thought of as a form of peace mediation at a low level, but also as a form of humanitarian mediation. So we will achieve the primary objective by identifying the main ethical problems and dilemmas in humanitarian negotiations, and then documenting how these are manifested in concrete cases. Then we will generate theory on contexts and conditions that need to be understood in order to really grasp these problems in a better way than what we currently have. Okay, so back to the drawing board. You see how now we're moving towards the focus and output of the project. On that way, I want to say a little about the background of the project, that kind of theoretical background. And there has been there is an emerging literature on this topic of humanitarian negotiations, both in scholarly work, but also a lot coming out of organizations and think tanks, so-called grey literatures. And you see some samples of this here, including a recent book from Karsten Wieland, who is actually part of this project in several capacities, and who questions the role of the principle of neutrality in assistance to Syria. And that's really representative of much of this literature, which focuses on the humanitarian principles and how a negotiation situation involves necessary compromises, and the question then becomes where to draw the lines between what is acceptable, what goes beyond humanitarian principles, when principles may be set aside legitimately, and whether that's the case. And these are things that are also discussed, for instance, in the work of Hugo Slim on humanitarian ethics, and his most recent book on humanitarian principles in contemporary settings of armed conflict, of war. So there is a sense that norms and principles really are essential for grappling with the problem of humanitarian negotiations. Yet it has not been studied as a question of ethics in this literature on negotiations, except perhaps in some earlier writings by Hugo Slim. And so it's rather thought of as questions relating to how to do humanitarian work in an efficient way, and to understanding why and how humanitarians work. But then there is this sense of it being still very much about morality, and this comes really starkly out in this article back from 2004 where Jan Egeland, then UN Emergency Relief Coordinator, says that as a humanitarian worker, you learn that if you're there to help the victims from the depths of hell, you have to speak to the devil. So he sort of frames this as the humanitarians as angels descending into hell and helping out. That's, of course, part of the humanitarian ethos, which is very much speaking to a moral agenda, even also to self-sacrifice in terms of accepting dangers, accepting involvement in tragic choices, as we will see. And in this article from 2018, you see how how it says that the principles of humanitarian relief are full of dilemmas when put into action. Our principles are there to guide us, not to prevent us from making compromises. And this comes from the upper priest of the humanitarian principles as they're formulated by the ICRC, as it comes from the president of ICRC, Peter Moore. The Center for Competence on Humanitarian Negotiations, under the lead of Claude Brüderlein, also looked into dilemmas in negotiations. And for instance, they have this survey from 2017 where they asked about how important a set of dilemmas were in the work of humanitarian workers. And the most important dilemma related to security rules for the protection of humanitarian workers versus the proximity to beneficiaries. But there are also other things like where to compromise when negotiating sensitive issues of international humanitarian law and human rights issues. The issues that humanitarian organizations are there to actually protect and promote, and still you need to compromise on some of these, and working with people who may, for instance, be responsible for grave war crimes in order to get the job done. There's also the issue of denunciation or advocacy versus silence, versus whether to speak out when witnessing grave violations of international humanitarian law, for instance, versus being a silent and efficient collaborator with those responsible for such actions in order to influence their behavior and maybe reduce the harm. It's a traditional so-called dirty hands problem, which is much discussed also within organizations, including MSF, which really has put a spotlight on this question of speaking out. Now, this is sort of crystallized into a question of where to draw the red lines. Some organizations don't like to speak about red lines because it's so hard to actually draw the line, and it's so context dependent that speaking of red lines and communicating red lines can be seen as somehow distorting a negotiation. But this is a very kind of classic model that CCHN presents of a negotiation setting as it seems from one of the parties, where you will enter a negotiation with an idea of the ideal outcome. You may have sort of a space between this and the bottom line of what is clearly kind of an acceptable but non-ideal outcome. And then there's a space again between this bottom line and the red line where you will need to make kind of further considerations. And this may be described as a sort of moral and principled gray zone. So hence the title of Red Lines and Gray Zones, focusing on this kind of space where the ethics is really crystallized into hard questions, hard choices. So we enter this topic by looking into these questions of where to draw the red lines, when to withdraw and let people suffer in the name of some principle because you're not willing to compromise further. And this can be because of instrumental concerns, because you think that, okay, if we compromise more now, we will not be able to do what we want in a different setting later, or it will have harmful longer term effects, even if we then have to let someone suffer, perhaps even die, who we could have helped if we stretched our limits even further. But this is also sort of an idealized representation of something which is far more complex. Firstly, a negotiation situation is always part of a larger story. So it's sort of artificial to isolate one decision like this or one negotiation situation like this and think of it as a straightforward set of alternatives, because it will be influenced by so many contextual factors. Who are the people involved? Who are those who will be affected by the longer term effects of the choices and so on? It's really, but still it's useful to boil it down to this simple model. The CCHN handbook that this is taken from also shows how different organizations in the same setting may have different red lines. For instance, when it comes to military escort. And you also see an illustration of how a negotiation between two parties will then obviously have a space between the bottom lines and red lines of those two parties, forming in it's kind of a fluid space. So the gray zone really is a gray zone which is relational. It's never just a gray zone constituted by the isolated considerations of one party. And when the negotiations take place between several parties, for instance, as in this simplified model between a government, an armed opposition, and a humanitarian organization, A, this space with red lines and gray zones becomes three-dimensional or even further dimensional. And often there will be many actors involved, directly or indirectly, when these lines are drawn and when the premises of the negotiation situation are formed. because of course the red lines and the ideal outcome is relative to what is perceived as possible and acceptable in a given situation. And that is the product of lots of different actors and structural conditions coming together. And that's why we have this focus also on the context and conditions of negotiations in this project. But is this really a question of ethics when it comes to the question of ideal outcome, bottom line, red lines? It is as much, at least, a question of efficiency or getting the job done that humanitarian organizations should do. And it's not necessarily about the values of the individual worker or of the head of an organization. It's about the values and the norms and objectives that are spelled out in an organization and that that organization is working towards. That can be food provision. And then the red lines relate to, okay, so what does it take to achieve this in the best way, all things considered? And those providing that food may know very well that food is not necessarily what's most important in this setting. It can even be counterproductive, but well, that's our role, that's our job. But then in these discussions, there's also this sense that there is at least a dimension of ethics in all of these settings. Partly in the motives of humanitarian organizations and in their objectives. They're often spelled out in very moral terms, of course. And when they work to get public support, they play on people's moral sentiments in order to get donations. But also there's a dimension of ethics in the personal capacities of those who are involved in these settings. And also when observers discuss and make up their mind about the decisions that organizations are made, there is always a mixture of ethical and more instrumental and political concerns. What do we mean with ethics then? Well, here we mean ethics in the very general sense of questions of what is morally right and wrong, what is morally good and bad. And we don't take a specific stance on how this question is to be understood and how it is to be theorized and answered. So the project is very open-ended as to this ethical dimension. Sociologically exploring how this looks in practice in different contexts. And that can provide the foundation for more systematic ethical analysis. And in theory of ethics, there's this notion of tragic choices and non-ideal theory, which is relevant in this context because the ethical dimension is often brought up when people experience really difficult dilemmas. And that's what's boiled down in the question of the red lines. Ethical dilemmas where you see two courses of action that both seem right, morally right, but that are mutually exclusive. You can't choose both. You can't both go for the full security of your staff and for proximity to and ability to help beneficiaries. So it's when organizations are confronted with these dilemmas that they often experience it as an ethical problem, because it's felt like an ethical or a moral problem. And it's what's called a tragic choice. as Hugo Slim calls it, or elaborates on in his work on humanitarian ethics. And this is then something that does not only relate to how organizations and individuals can make the right ethical choices. It's also about a reflection and understanding of the experiences and the choices that they have made and that they have to live with, and providing a sort of language for sharing and thinking and reflecting on these experiences. So that's another reason why one should look into this. Maybe a project on this subject will not lead to better choices, but maybe it will at least lead to more awareness and a better ability to sort of live with the choices that people have to make under non-ideal circumstances. Yet humanitarian organizations are not innocent angels in a field of evil. This is, a misrepresentation, a bad starting point for thinking of the ethics of humanitarian negotiations, because humanitarian organizations today are part of a larger political picture where they are empowered through different political actors, and where they play a political role, and the local contexts should not be reduced to, hell. There's this discussion on localization, decolonization of humanitarian action, and the first step could be not to just represent it as a field of hell. Although, of course, when Egeland put it like this was not what he had in mind. Of course, there is a meaning to it. It makes sense to put it in this way, metaphorically. But when it comes to this as a kind of a moral problem, one should get beyond this representation of the humanitarians as angels in hell. And there's been a lot of recent, very interesting, important contributions discussing this political dimension of humanitarian action. Work of Michael Barnett, David Kennedy, David Reef, lots of literatures problematize this field, Mark Duffield, and contribute to a better conception of the actual political nature of often apolitical, supposedly apolitical humanitarian action. Hence, the exploration of ethics in negotiations cannot end with this humanitarian outlook, the question of how can we implement aid in line with our principles. That's the starting point. But in order to understand that question and really cross-examine it and get a better sense of the ethics of negotiations, one needs to get beyond that and see and have a broader perspective of those practices as seen from the communities, the political contexts where they happen. Hence, we approach it as a question of pragmatic humanitarian governance. You see how power is involved in this notion of governance in complex cultural settings of political struggle. It's not straightforward settings of a humanitarian disaster where the humanitarian actor enters and has the solution to a humanitarian problem. It's settings of political struggle where the organizations get embedded into complex cultural settings and where there is a need for also awareness of what the humanitarians bring to this table. Okay, so that's the background. and part of the motivation behind this project. And we now, on this, in this picture, come to the focus and the output of the project. And as you see, there's also a point called surprises. When bringing all these people together to investigate this, a lot will come out of it that is not planned at this point. And I'm hoping for positive surprises. But based on what we have at this point, the focus of the project will be constituted by three elements: a political analysis, an ethical analysis, and analysis of the local contexts of practices of humanitarian negotiations, as I just explained. So we see ethics as a dimension of practice, but not as the full story of humanitarian negotiations. We zoom in on this dimension, cross-examine it, and then we want to zoom out again and place it in the larger picture and leave it there. So the analytical framework is not to isolate ethics, but to think about ethics in what you could call a situated, holistic manner, as I've just kind of played around with together with a colleague, Henrik Syse, in another context. And we approach this through the research question: what are the ethical problems in humanitarian negotiation, and how should they be analyzed? Very general question, as you see. And we explore it through the perceptions of experts and practitioners, through case studies, and through theory of ethics and global politics that is relevant. So when calling this an exploration, it's literally an exploration of something that we don't know exactly what we will find or how we should frame it. And if we end this exploration with a better way of speaking of it than what I am able to do at this point, we have sort of succeeded and created a platform for future, more specific explorations. So the methods we use are survey, interviews, consultations, qualitative case studies involving different methods, and philosophical analysis. And the research question is this very general question. This general research question is then reflected in a set of subsidiary questions that you see here. I won't read them out. But these three questions, they are then again reflected in the different so-called work packages of the project. The output will be the most important output, as it's a research project, is scholarly journal articles. And we will also organize a journal forum and a special issue of an international peer-reviewed journal, opening the discussion also for people outside of this project. Then we will have courses as some of the outputs, both university and for practitioners. We will produce some blog posts, policy briefs, and podcast interviews, podcasts, and public events, both online and offline. And then we will participate in conferences, presenting papers, organizing panels. See in the bottom left corner here kind of our scheme for how to disseminate efficiently from the project, but I won't go into the details. And then, of course, we have running research communication throughout the project related to our websites, where we will have news and events and so on presented, both at the PRIA website and the website of the Norwegian Center for Humanitarian Studies, which, as I mentioned, is a collaboration between PRIO and two other institutes, Christian Michelsen Institute and the Norwegian Institute for International Affairs, NUPI. So we have a shared website, which is separate from the PRIO site. And we also have social media accounts and so on that will be used for dissemination. So you can follow those throughout the project. But the most important dissemination will still happen through the personal networks and of the members of the project, and also through their participation in other activities where they can draw on what they do in this project. So how do we get to this output? That's the last part of this presentation. And this is a more kind of internal one, except the one on the team, which I should actually have started with for an external audience. So I'll just go very quickly through that. But you see, I'm now going to this point on work packages, the team and timeline, and that's it. So here you see a figure of how a set of 6 work packages are interconnected in the project and all circle around work package 1 that addresses the main research question through an exploration of relevant theory and methodology. And this is also in the project description reflected in a Gantt chart, and I hope you notice how there are matching colors between the work packages and the work packages in that Gantt chart, which is until now the main achievement of this project, to have matching colors across these two figures. Okay, and I've spelled out kind of the different tasks and deliverables of the different work packages, but I won't go into that in this version. But this is how it looks. This is how kind of work packages are built up. We have a survey and then a set of consultations that will give us more understandings of how this looks from the perspective of practitioners and also experts on humanitarian action and negotiation. But then the most important part is the case studies, where this will be cross-examined by looking also into how these ethical problems and dilemmas look from the perspective of the counterparts, as well as local communities and those affected by the negotiations. So we have a set of tentative case studies that will be adjusted throughout the planning phase this year. And these are complementary, so they're based on a selection of not similar or necessarily comparative cases, but different cases that will demonstrate different aspects of this very broad topic. Then the journal forum and special issue, and education and training activities, and the final part where we return to the questions and the working papers from the first work package, seen against the backdrop of the cases and the theoretical exploration. So, the team, at this point, the researchers and key team members involved are the ones listed to the left here. And then as you see, we have people then representing partner institutions like the CCHN and under the ICRC that I mentioned, and University College Dublin and NOHA Network, represented by Solania Maitra. Then Pontificia University Javeriana in Bogota, Colombia, represented by Manuel Salamanca. We have Tribhuvan University in Nepal with Pitambar Bandari. I'm skipping the titles, apologies. Then Oxford Institute for Ethics, Law and Armed Conflict is represented through Emanuela Chiara Gillard. We have Lars Christie from the Inland Norway University, and we have Zenonas Chiaras from the Prio Cyprus Center, and then Karsten Wieland, Maria Jumbe, Christina Ropstorff, Aisha Bala Akal, and myself from Prio and NCHS. Then we have a management team, we have a scientific advisory board, we might add a few names to that. Then we have an expert group in the forming an international group, which will consist also, it will include also Jérôme Grimaud, who I mentioned in the beginning. And we also have a Norwegian branch of this, of major Norwegian organizations. And this Norwegian branch can meet physically in Oslo more often than the international group will do. So the project will primarily happen over the next 3 years. This is how it looks for 2022. And that's it. So in the bottom right corner, you see synergies and spin-offs, and this is not to be underestimated as an output from a project like this, a large collaborative project that will achieve the things that we promised, but it will also allow for other things to happen throughout this period that may be far more important and consequential than what we can promise in the project description at this point. Okay, thanks a lot for the patience, and I'm looking forward to doing this project as the project leader. Thank you.